Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak to the Taxation, Annual Rates, Foreign Superannuation and Remedial Matters Bill. The Green Party will be supporting this bill because it does make some significant and important changes, even though there are parts of the bill we don't agree with. It is the bill, of course, that sets the annual rates, and in a sense that's the bit we disagree with the most. And that's because this government has introduced tax changes which are essentially very large tax cuts to upper income earners and increasing GST on everyone else. The cost of this government's tax changes to income tax rates are about $1 billion a year to pay for the tax reductions for the top 10% of income earners. So the top 10% of income earners in New Zealand were given a tax cut by this government that's costing everybody else about $1 billion a year. So there's $1 billion a year hole in the budget as a result of the tax cuts that were introduced by this government. Now, if you think about it, what that means is that the entire proceeds of the asset sales so far, $4 billion, is eaten up by 4 years of tax cuts for upper income earners. And so it put a big hole in the budget as a result of the rates that are set in this bill. That meant that it had to come from somewhere else, and of course has had a significant effect on the amount of money that the government's had to borrow, and has also had a significant impact on what comes of the money from the asset sales. I mean, basically it's as if we didn't sell the assets because we've chewed through that $4 billion by the time of the next election. We will have chewed through the lot. So they're actually selling assets in order to pay for tax cuts for the top 10% of earners in New Zealand. And you only have to think about that for a second to realise the inequity of the scheme that they've introduced. Beyond that, Mr Speaker, I think it is remarkable some of the missing elements of this bill as well. If you think about if the bill is truly to rationalise the tax system, as the government has said in its speeches, and there are elements of that that are undoubtedly true, what about capital gains tax? New Zealand has at the moment a very complicated system for taxing capital gains, and a lot of the complication comes from intent. So when you trade houses or shares or other capital items, was it your intent when you were engaged in that buying and selling to make a profit out of it or not? And so the tax system, the IRD, is required to interpret the intent of the buyers and sellers of capital items to determine whether they are traders or not. And if they are traders, then they're liable for the tax. If they're not traders, then they're not. This creates a very complex and subjective taxation system. So when the OECD did a review of New Zealand's tax system, aside from saying that it's ridiculous, of course, or that it's extraordinary that New Zealand doesn't have an overarching tax on capital gains, the other part that I think people don't realise is it means that we have a very complicated system of taxing capital gains, which is based on subjective decisions about the intent of the people who make the capital gains. So if the tax official decides, based on some kind of measure of behaviour, that the person who made the capital gains by buying or selling their house or buying or selling their shares, the intent was they were a trader who was making money out of this, then they will go and say you've got to pay tax. But if you're not a trader, then you don't have to pay the tax. It's of course very difficult and subjective for the IRD to establish this. Why don't we have a consistent rule for taxing capital gains like pretty much every other OECD country? That would be a much simpler tax system for dealing with capital gains than the very complicated system that we operate at the moment. But complexity seems important to the government, so it's developed this very complicated system of taxing capital gains, the effect of which is to protect the income of upper income earners. Because we know that when we look at the taxation from other jurisdictions, we know how much income comes from capital gains, and what you find is that the top 1% make a big proportion of their income from capital gains. And so they're able to avoid paying taxes on most of their income because most of their income comes from capital gains, which is untaxed. Whereas in most other jurisdictions that income is taxed. So not only does the government go into maintain a very complicated system of taxing capital gains in order to protect the tax-free income of the top 1%, which is the effect of the current capital gains tax rules. But on the other hand, they also introduced tax cuts, which meant that upper income earners got given $1 billion a year by having big tax cuts, and of course that's got to come from somewhere. And where that comes from is other taxpayers through increased GST, which we know disproportionately affects those on low incomes, and where it comes from is by selling assets. So effectively the government has sold assets of the people in order to fund the tax cuts for the top 10% of income earners for 4 years. But what will happen after those 4 years? Well, obviously they'll run out of things to sell and they'll turn to other things to sell. The other part I think that's interesting about the New Zealand tax system is the treatment of foreign trusts. New Zealand has a very unusual foreign trust system, which basically means that foreigners can place assets in New Zealand in foreign trusts, and as long as none of the income from within those foreign trusts comes from New Zealand, there's no requirement to pay tax on the income earned by those foreign trusts. So they are tremendously effective tax avoidance mechanisms for foreigners offshore. And New Zealand now has quite a significant industry of offshore people who are trying to avoid paying tax offshore, putting their money in foreign trusts in New Zealand, which are then not visible to their home government. Now, this is part of the international problem of tax avoidance. So if, for example, we take the example of a Mexican drug lord who has illegally and illicitly earned many hundreds of millions of dollars, they can place that money in New Zealand and the Mexican government will never know that that asset is in a foreign trust in New Zealand. And it will get effectively no tax from the Mexican government. Now, there's no way for the Mexican government to ever know the identity, the person who is the beneficiary of this foreign trust, because under New Zealand foreign trust rules, there is no requirement to identify the beneficiary of that trust to the external world. You need somebody in New Zealand who's the front for the trust, but you don't have to identify who the beneficiary of that trust is. And that's why New Zealand is now being tagged as one of the places in the world where it's safe to hide money and avoid paying tax. And so we've become part of the international network of tax avoidance by people who are trying to avoid paying tax internationally. And this bill was a great opportunity. It's a remedial matters bill to fix up a big hole in the New Zealand tax system, which is around the treatment of foreign trusts. The change that could have been made is actually not that hard. It could have simply been transparency. No one's saying that we should apply New Zealand tax on this income which was earned offshore, though you could have a debate about that. But even if you just had transparency about it, who are the beneficiaries of these foreign trusts? If you had transparency about it, then immediately it would become visible who are those who are trying to use the New Zealand foreign trust regime to avoid paying tax internationally. And then it would become immediately available to the Mexican government or any other government to see who is hiding money using the foreign trust rules in New Zealand, which is one of the big holes in the current New Zealand system. The other part that I think is useful just to talk about a little bit is around the IT system. I know that I think David Clark talked about this earlier because we had IRD in front of the Finance and Expenditure Committee just a couple of days ago. What is interesting here is that the scale of the expenditure on this new IT system. I mean, we're talking as, ballpark figures at least $1 billion on an IT system. And so what the New Zealand IT industry is saying is, will IRD, as part of its program of building this system, make sure that the New Zealand IT sector can bid for parts of this contract? And essentially they're finding that IRD are not being particularly facilitative to the development of the New Zealand IT industry as they go about building this giant new system. And if anything, they seem to have given the inside running to Capgemini, which is a big offshore IT company that is renowned for avoiding paying its tax. It's a renowned tax avoider in the United Kingdom. And they have been given some of the inside running to get these big contracts on the IT system. So it seems to me that this is not a really good way to go about it. Obviously, IRD want a system that works really well, which is fair enough. But in the process, we also need to keep an eye on economic development opportunities for New Zealand when we have these giant New Zealand government procurement projects. And this is a giant project. Nonetheless, there are some good elements in this bill, such as tightening some of the concessionary regimes around mining. And so even though they're minor improvements, we certainly support those improvements around mining because the tax system is very concessionary towards mining. And so tightening it ever so slightly is progress, but still New Zealand still has one of the lowest royalty regimes in the Western world when it comes to mining. Basically, we say to foreign mining companies, come in, help yourself, we're not going to tax you much, and if there's any mess, we'll pay to clean it up, which is a bit sad. So this bill tightens up some of the concessions around mining, which is a good thing, and there's a few other good things in there. So we will be supporting this bill. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call Maggie Berry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak.